welcome back to Ancient Greece, where we will be continuing with our High Classical, Late Classical, hopefully get to Hellenistic. And let's head back to our Acropolis. So we're up in the Acropolis, and this is this hill you can see across Athens. And we were examining our Parthenon. And now let's move on to some other structures. So if we look at the entrance, we have a series of these pylons. So remember with our ancient Egypt, Temple of Amun-Ra, in the entire complex you had these gateways that you had to enter, where in that case access became increasingly restricted. That isn't so much the case here, but what this does mark is that you're entering this sacred place. And so here you're walking up these stairs. You have these series of these gateways, and this had been changed over time. Here's entering the first one, upon which the ceiling apparently was painted blue with these gold stars. Everything would have been painted. But let's look at this Temple of Athena, Nike. So here we are, by Callicrates. And consider how different this looks. We don't have a full ambulatory walkway. We don't have this peristyle surrounding porch held up by columns. This is a much smaller structure. It's more closed off. It's also not easily accessible. So this temple specifically wasn't necessarily open in the same way that our Parthenon was. But let's take a look at it. So it's a small marble temple, and it's dedicated to Athene Nike. I keep saying that like the clothing brand. But this is Athena when she is in her victorious form, in which there's another embodiment of her. So we were looking at, with the Parthenon, Athena Parthenos in her virgin form. So this is a different characteristic of her. And if we'll notice, there's a different set of orders here. We have a frieze around the top, which we're going to be looking at. So here's from a different angle on the other side. So you don't need to know that, but the name of this type of style. But again, it is closed off. And here we have our Ionic order columns. So our Parthenon was of the Doric columns, that order, and here we have our Ionic. And this mimics, as you'll see in the center, a scroll. So think of like a curled up scroll, this curled up paper. It's supposed to mimic that. And it came later. It came after the Doric. So the Doric is considered a more masculine style, whereas the Ionic becomes more decorative, and it's considered a more feminine style. Later, again, the Corinthian order comes about, and that's especially popular amongst the Romans later. So I want to take a look at a particular artwork from the frieze. And here is Victory adjusting her sandal. So across this frieze, there's many images of Nike. She's bringing sacrificial bulls. She's celebrating the spoils of war from when they technically defeated Persia, holding trophies, etc. However, here we see her pausing, and where she's simply adjusting her sandal. So let's consider the female body and the changes that we've seen, all the way from the Orientalizing period with our Daedalus style to our archaic. We looked at the Parthenon with the heavy drapery to outline the human figure. And here we have a high classical example of the female figure. And consider how drapery has been changed here. It's not as heavy. We could say almost the Parthenon drapery looks like this heavy velvet, whereas here on our Victory Athena, it's much thinner, and it looks like it's clinging to her body, and we see a lot more details. So this is, again, the excuse in which they can show the female form. We aren't seeing a nude figure here. We're not pushing the boundaries too far, but we are pushing the boundaries, and they're able to do so under the excuse of this wet drapery look. And look at the human body and how this engagement in the study of optics and observation is coming through here, where this looks extremely naturalistic. You yourself have likely been in this position adjusting your shoe at some point. And it really humanizes her to this extent of this connection to the gods, where she's pausing to adjust her sandal. I love this artwork. So look at the pose. She's bending over. Her body looks realistic, even so with the fold of the stomach as it naturally would when you are in this position. And so, yeah, it's this simple, everyday gesture. As she prepares to, some say that she's taking off her sandal instead of just adjusting it, and that she's preparing to enter some sacred space where she would need to take off her shoes. We're not really sure, but either way, it's one of the main admirations at the Acropolis Museum right next to this structure. Now let's head on over to the north side of the Acropolis with the Erechtheion, and the purple over here on the left. Now, this is the place where it is believed that that story of Poseidon versus Athena trying to get the favor of Athens to become their patron deity. And so, remember how I was saying that the two were battling, and they were, well, in this form of war, they were trying to show what they could give the people of this new place. And where Poseidon took his trident, he hit this rock, and out came this water. It seemed really exciting at first. But then you realize Poseidon is the god of the sea, so it is salt water. You can't do much with that. Whereas Athena grew an olive tree. And so in this space, in one of these structures, they were added on over different times. There's different arguments about where. Some claim on the porch, some claim in one of the structures that I've seen. But for the most part, this is believed to be the place where that rock was that Poseidon hit, and where the original olive tree grew. So this is dedicated to them, and to that story, and to their patron deity. But what this structure seems to be most known for is for the caryatid figures. And this is a obviously extremely different column that we have looked at. This is not one of the three orders. And look at the realism in their stance. They're in this contrapposto stance. You can see that they've shifted their weight into different legs depending on where they're located. We have the drapery that clings to their body to show their human form. So there's this great sense of realism. And again, everything would have been decorative and painted and bright. So here they are within the museum, and the braids in the hair, this realism. And so there we have our Acropolis. Now to end our high classical, this is a grave stele. So we began this unit by looking at a crater, in which this was part of the funerary ritual. It was a grave marker. You would pour liquids, perhaps a certain wine or other sacred liquids, into it to down the center through the open body to honor the deceased. In the archaic period, our Koros and our Kori mostly demarcate these graves, so they were massive grave markers. Whereas here we're moving into steles again. And this is a time period where many of them, again, are being mass-produced. We see little variations, such as in this one I'll discuss. But these are pretty large grave markers, as you can see. This isn't this exact one, but here's the general size at the Archaeological Museum in Athens. And so here's a new term to introduce called a genre scene. So a genre scene is just a normal, everyday scene of life. This isn't a religious subject matter. This isn't some mythical story. But these are everyday people doing an everyday activity. So let's look at some of the close-ups. Here we have the seated figure, and what she's doing is looking through her jewelry box. Standing in front of her is likely her servant. She's of this lower station because she's standing in front of the seated figure. But again, she's just going through some of her jewelry. So this is an everyday scene. It's not anything special. It doesn't have this major significance to some event. It's not a historical scene. Some say it may represent her dowry that was given to her husband upon their marriage. The jewelry would have been painted on. Right now we can't see it. It wasn't carved out. It's not visible to us anymore, but it would have been painted. So she's on a pedestal. We know that this main figure is important. She's seated and on a pedestal. And let's appreciate the sense of drapery to outline the human form again. And the figure on the left is in this contrapposto pose. We don't see her standing leg, but we do see her relaxed leg. So here we have the grave stele of Hegesso. And we know this because it's written at the top. It identifies her and her father. So it says Hegesso, daughter of Proxenus. This is found in the Dipylon Cemetery, the same cemetery in which we started with our geometric crater. And you'll notice that this architectural framework around it, which gives us this sense of space. Because notice how the figures and Hegesso's chair overlaps in front of that space. So let's appreciate that for a moment. If we're looking at the area closest to us, it would be her seat and her pedestal. And then as space slightly recedes, we see her foot, which overlaps her servant's foot. Her knees overlap her servant's. And so there is this sense of space with this relief. So we have so many examples of this. Sculpture has become extremely popular. There are workshops producing this, so this is produced on a mass scale with, again, the slight little individualism added to it, only with the name on top. But in general, these are generic figures that are available for purchase because it has become extremely popular. Now let's move into our late classical period. So our late classical period is defined by the Peloponnesian War. And this is the city-state of Sparta versus the city-state of Athens. And Athens is crushed. They're defeated. So we start to see this shift. Like any major historical event, there's a shift in the style. And so people turn away from Praxiteles' canon that we saw, where he set up this notion that the perfect human proportions are that the head is 1/7 of the body. And so our humans become a little longer. They become almost lanky looking to an extent. And so we see that with our Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Knidos. Here are different versions. We have about 50 copies that remain today. We do not have the original. The original, in this case, interestingly enough, was actually marble. We talked about with our other examples, there were so many that were our Roman copies based on bronze originals, but here the original was marble. Now we do have coins that exist that show her. So this tells us that this was an extremely important sculpture. And it changed the world because this is our first female nude. All of our other ones were clothed. Even if it was this very thin clothing and we can still see the female form, here we have the first female nude. And I'll talk about his excuse of how he was able to portray this in a moment. But there's so many examples. And so this is based off of, or most historians argue that Aphrodite is based off of our Inanna, later known as Ishtar, that we studied in the ancient Near East. She has many similar motifs, etc. She's the goddess of the sea, of seafaring. She's the goddess of war. And of course, she's more known for being the goddess of love and fertility. So she has these different tasks in which she's responsible for. And so this was made for the Cnidians, pronounced differently. Different spelling. Here are some of the versions that exist. And if you'll notice, what they have in common is they're in this contrapposto pose, so we should immediately recognize that. in this naturalistic pose, and where she seems to be holding or almost leaning upon this drapery that's hanging over this decorative vase. Somewhat looking off into the distance or looking to the side. Something has caught her attention where she has turned her head. So the excuse for creating this female form is that she was emerging from her bath. So she had just gotten out of her bath. She's reaching for this drapery, think along the lines of a towel, and someone has walked in on her. So that was the excuse, that she is not purposefully in this sexual manner, that she was just caught emerging from the bath. And notice how she tries to cover herself, where her right arm bends over and starts to cover her pubic area. But this actually draws our attention to this area. So again, it's this play on, he's making these excuses of why he's able to show the female form. Is she's not emerging from the bath. Of course, she's not going to be wearing clothes in the bath. And, she's trying to cover herself. So there still is this sense of modesty. But it actually draws our attention to this area. So this was extremely risque because it's the first female nude. And it was put in a public place. So it was built for our temple of Aphrodite at Knidos. This is near another Tholos of Delphi. If you've ever heard the oracles at Delphi, this is near that area. But here she is, where she's emerging from her bath. And so actually Praxiteles gave the king who was the patron of this, who sponsored this artwork to give to this temple. I should mention a tholos is a round temple, so we see the columns surrounding it. And it was placed right in the center of this one. And so this one king sponsored it. And Praxiteles gave him 2 copies. One was clothed, think our wet drapery, and one was nude. And the king had, I messed up there. The king chose the clothed one. And so he gave this one to that tholos, this nude one. And this one, of course, became much more popular, whereas he thought the clothed one would be popular. But it's risque. So just think of today, where this idea of the female nude sells better, similar to ancient Greece. Now, Praxiteles changes the human form. Again, we're rejecting this previous canon. There's a shift in style marked by our shift in this war that occurred, where now he has the head is 1/8 the length of the body. So it's more elongated. These figures often are described as looking lankier than our high classical. So the late classical, there's this shift. We also have the rising status of the artist, where he's challenging these norms and where he is successful. This becomes extremely popular through the rest of ancient Greece into Rome, etc. And this is where the female nude in Western art begins, which we'll see for the rest of our history. So it starts this new trend. So consider back to our Nike adjusting her sandal, where it's a much more humanized pose, where we've seen this. We identify this pose. We've been there adjusting our shoe quickly. And where here she is emerging from her bath, just as we take baths. So it is this more humanized version of the gods. People are being humbled after losing another war. And this changed the art world. I mean, it became such a tourist spot. There's so many copies that are made. Even to this day, 58 survive. So many have had different reactions to it. It definitely exhibits agency on the viewer in many forms. Now, to transition into the Hellenistic period, we must discuss Alexander the Great. I also noticed a typo on the handout, and that I unfortunately kept copying over to the previous PowerPoints. I must have just clicked 3 twice. So Hellenistic art is from 332 to 30 BCE. Okay. So Alexander the Great was from Macedonia, another city-state area. And he conquers a great portion of the globe. He reaches all the way even into India. And upon his death, his empire split up. And the focus of the empire, and really the power and the new art that we'll look at, actually transitions into this region of Turkey. things have shifted over. I mean, think of how well established Greece is. So we're creating new art in a new area under a new ruler. And we're going to focus on the Pergamon on the coast here. So we're close to our area of Greece and our islands of Greece. And we must reference the Gauls with our next piece. So the Gauls we're going to see again and again. If anything about ancient Rome, even Caesar was still battling the Gauls. So they were a formidable force, primarily from like France, Belgium area originally, partially Germany. And here's our dying Gaul. So Hellenistic refers Greek-like, because again we have this massive empire which has been split up. And Athens is not our main city-state. It was conquered by a ruler from another area. Macedonia had a slightly different culture as well. So this word Greek-like helps to define this shift, this difference. And again, we're even moving geographically here. And so here we have this idea of drama. Now, this is during a time period as well, during the Hellenistic period, where theater is extremely, extremely popular. It's very expressive, it's very emotional, it's very dramatic. So think of how during difficult times, how we even turn to TV, our version of the theater, etc., as a way to forget about that, to feel these other ranges of emotions. And so here we have this element of theater coming through in Hellenistic art. It's much more dramatic here. So here we have our dying Gaul. That he's dying, he's let go of his sword, and we see the wound in his side. And here marks our shift, is this facial expression. We have not seen these very dramatic or defined emotions on any of our faces prior to now. Here's the area where we can see where he was stabbed. It's a fatal wound. And here he is accepting his fate. Okay, so here's a new term, expressionism. And this is how you can identify Hellenistic art versus our previous periods, where there's a huge focus on these facial expressions. They're very expressionistic, and then we call this expressionism. And so we see the pain in his face, not just like the pain of this wound, but this thoughtfulness of this transition, that he knows that he is about to die. He's considering this. The realization has hit him. We see that frontally, we see that in profile. So look at his furrowed brows and where his forehead is creased, where we see his lips are slightly parted, and we see this contemplation going through rolling through him as he understands that this is the end. And so this is how you can tell that it is Hellenistic versus any other style, is the facial expressions and how it's extremely dramatic. And so these sculptures they're trying to convey human expression and human emotion now. They've already, think back to our classical, where they were able to hit our peak of defining the human body in its natural state, an idealized state. And so here we still have an idealized naturalistic body, and now they're experimenting with facial expressions, which we hadn't really seen before. Some other aspects that should be familiar is how the Romans have marked him, or how the Greeks have marked him as an enemy, as the defeated. So here he has this wild hair. It's not these loose but well-kept curls of our Greeks. It's pretty wild, it's chunky, it's all over the place. And he has a mustache. We will see beards, but we do not see just a mustache. So this is really wild. This marks him as other, the wild hair and the mustache. Also, this band around his neck is actually jewelry. It's called a torque. These are still really popular as bracelets. You could buy them at major jewelry stores across the globe, etc. And this is indicative of the Gauls. They had this originally. It was really popular on their necks, or again as bracelets. So this tells us who he is. And so, again, he's this barbarian with messy hair. FYI, that term barbarian actually comes from the ancient Greeks, and it means foreigner. Because when they heard others talk, such as the Gauls, they would say bar, bar, bar. Like, it's like bar, blah, blah, blah. So think of today how we would be like, oh, blah, blah, blah. There was like a bar, bar, bar. So barbarian actually means foreigner. So now it has different connotations of wild, etc. But originally, this to show a barbarian, to show a foreigner, especially a defeated one, we have these wild elements, which we've recognized for millennium. But his idealism also shows that, again, this was a formidable foe, which in turn helps us to appreciate the Greeks better who defeated them. It's not these weaklings that they defeated, that in fact it is a formidable foe. And this sculpture was part of a monument. There were a series of other figures of dying Gaul shown to commemorate a victory. And so again, let's compare from our archaic up through our early and high classical, and how we have this idealized body, which we've seen, but it's become even more naturalistic, realistic. But now we're focusing on this expressionism of the Hellenistic period, this drama. So here is an artwork that you likely recognize, our winged victory, or Nike again, of Samothrace. This is at the Louvre. As you enter and walk up their grand staircase, it is front and center. And so we have this drapery. She's not full nude. But before we discuss her figure style, let's take a moment to appreciate this wing here and how extremely realistic it looks, and how this artist obviously studied the wings of birds for a long period of time. Every aspect of Greek life is such a form of study and philosophy and observation, etc. And so this is in Samothrace, or was, and it was part of this victory monument, which they think was part of to commemorate this naval victory from 191 BCE. And so this was made the following year to commemorate that. It was located up on this slight hill, and in front of that hill was a pond. And we can see that the remnants of where she stood was on like the bow of this ship. And so she would have, of course, had her head and been holding this staff and this horn, announcing their victory. And so we have this wet drapery. Though in this context, it makes sense because she is on this ship. So the wind is whipping at her. Her body, we can see like the wind is harsh, it's strong, and that she's pushing herself against it. It's also wet according to this context. So there's this drama, this contrapposto of the torso, and even a little bit of a twist as she stands up tall in this form of victory. So there's this illusion of wind. We get this sense of movement, not only with her body, but with the external wind. So let's talk about the great altar of Zeus and Athena. And we're heading back to Pergamon. And this is now in the Berlin Museum. And you can see it's surrounded by this very high relief frieze. Okay, so this is extremely high relief, where I could almost wrap my hand around almost the backside of, let's say, our main central figure's arms. And so this is, again, an altar. It's dedicated to Zeus and Athena. But what it's showing is our gigantomachy. And so this was a battle. Actually, before we head there, let's look at our some of the different scenes and these different poses and the drama of these facial expressions. So these dramatic poses, these dramatic facial expressions, etc., help to define our Hellenistic art. Just think drama and expressionism. And so this is a great battle, a famous battle, the giants versus the Olympian gods. So you may have heard of the word Gaia, and Gaia is the earth goddess, and her children were the giants. And at one point, they begin to battle the pantheon of the Olympic gods. And here we see Athena fighting one of the main giants in Claudius with her famous Aegis shield. We'll see that. Most of our military scenes have had shields in them. But here she is battling him and her brothers. But over to her, I guess let's start at the ground level, our Gaia. So here is Gaia. She's extremely large to show this idea of these giants. And where she reaches up and she's pleading with Athena. Even though she's missing her nose and her mouth, we get this real sense through her, the position of her eyes, looking up, that she is pleading, that she is mournful. She's pleading for her sons who have entered into this battle. She's pleading for mercy. But Athena, our goddess of victory, here she is in her victory form. There would have been likely a victory wreath crowned above her. But she is instead gripping his hair as she's pulling him up by the hair to go speak to Zeus, to face his wrath. And so, yeah, he's also being twisted by this serpent creature. There were other figures across the scene, and it was this long narrative showing this massive battle between the giants and the Olympic gods. And so, again, this drama. These really dramatic facial expressions help to define our Hellenistic era. Of course, we're seeing extremely idealized figures here, but there's many other sculptures from this era in which more ordinary people would have been shown of various ages, but they always have these dramatic facial expressions. Notice how his hair is also wild. It's not in any type of elaborate style or curly, controlled curls, etc. So there is this sense of wild. And we get this sense of that he is in great pain now. She is gripping his hair, pulling him up as he's also being bitten by this giant serpent. So very expressionistic. Oh yeah, and she's pulling him up to Zeus because to defeat them, again, their mother is the earth goddess, so you have to remove them from earth to bring them up to the heavens above Mount Olympia. To defeat them, to help pull them away from their power, essentially. So here we have a close-up. And look at the use of drapery to create movement and to define our bodies, our idealized bodies. With her shield. Here's our Alexandros, our Aphrodite Venus de Milo. I'm not going to spend much time on her, but I just wanted to at least briefly mention her because she's so popular with these missing arms. You see her referenced frequently, or at least you will, in pop culture. However, we don't have the same drama as what we've seen that defines our Hellenistic period, so note that there is still these classical elements that are popular. This was actually, it's located in the Louvre now, and it was picked up by Napoleon and his soldiers, and it had this sense of, this form of propaganda that he brought back with him. And it became really popular once he brought it to Paris. But there's a lot of arguments. It was found in pieces, and there's some arguments that this torso doesn't belong to to these legs because it's just so elongated. Her center, her belly, etc. seems especially long. Her neck seems especially long. So part of that may be true because it doesn't seem proportional, doesn't seem to match up. But again, we have, there is this sense of rejecting the past, of creating these new styles and experimentation, because of the new political context that had occurred with a new Alexander the Great and conquering this region, and then the breakup of the empire after him. So it could be a stylistic difference. But extremely popular. And again, female nude, but it's okay because she was dressed. She did have this draped around her. It seems to be falling down. She's trying to catch it with her leg that's bent. So pushing the boundaries in this marked way. And so to end our Hellenistic period, let's discuss our seated boxer. Here we have our bronze. And he was actually found in the baths next to an athletic gym in Rome. And this is important with understanding this context. So we have to consider this humbling experience of the losses that ancient Greece has had at this point. And this realism, despite the great strength, the physical strength, despite the great intellectualism, Athens had fallen, different areas of this whole region had been conquered, etc. And so part of the reason for that drama is that sense of anguish and realism. It's less of an idealized world. Yes, we're seeing idealized figure styles, etc. But there is this understanding that death does come, sometimes in an unexpected way. And so this seated boxer, he's not young. We can tell, obviously, that his beard indicates his age, that he is older. And it's elaborately and precisely decorative and emphasized. And so let's look at his facial expression as he turns and looks upward, especially compared if we consider the early classical with another older Greek bronze statue. There's almost this sense of anguish that we see with these furrowed brows as they turn upward toward the middle, the slightly parted mouth. And we can see he's been through a lot. He is a boxer. He has a broken nose that is healed. We see a cauliflower-shaped ears, which are indicative of even modern-day boxers from being punched. His face has been through it all, where he has these scars, etc., which were highlighted by copper material. So there's a real emphasis. The artist is drawing your attention to his scars and to his physical hardships that he's been through. And so he looks over his shoulder, in this defeated, seated position. And so we get this sense that perhaps this was his last match, that he was great at one point, but now this is the end of his boxing career. And so there's this humbling, simultaneous, sense of sadness, where this is the end. And this was purposefully placed next to a gym as a reminder. At least that's what we believe of this sense of that we will all, at some point, meet, the end with whatever, in this case, of his career, as well as his age versus the younger boxers who are training next door, etc. And so this helps to humble and remind these younger boxers. Think of, it's almost this fight against cockiness to an extent, that the Greeks had been cocky and that they had been outdone, that they had been brutally defeated by different people at different times. And so there's this reminder to keep things humble, to focus on what you need to do, that it may not last forever. So, in other words, to live life the fullest, while you can, and appreciate those boxing matches while you can, because it doesn't last forever. So our seated boxer, again, this reminder to live life to the fullest. We only have one. Yeah, so I love this figure. Just this dramatic twist, this looking upward. And he was seated. He is lifelike. So walking into this area of these baths after your workout and looking down upon him, of this reminder to enjoy it while you can. And that wraps up our Hellenistic period in ancient Greece.